The crimson streak of dawn painted the horizon as though the very sky was bleeding its way into morning, casting long shadows across the dusty road that wound like a snake through the rugged terrain outside Grass Valley, California. The year was 1876, and like most mornings in the gold country, this one promised heat that would soon scorch the land mercilessly. But it wasn't the promise of another scorching day that caught Hank Xavier's attention as he rode his chestnut mare along the eastern trail. It was the lone figure of a woman, her dress tattered and her steps uneven as she trudged forward with determination, despite her obvious exhaustion. Hank pulled on the reins, slowing Penny to a stop as he approached the woman. Her head was bowed, dark hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders, and she didn't seem to notice him until his horse nickered softly. When she looked up, Hank saw a face that, despite being smudged with dirt and marked with fatigue, held an unmistakable beauty-high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of summer storms. "Madam," he called, tipping his worn leather hat. "You all right?" The woman stopped, swaying slightly on her feet, and regarded him with wary eyes. She didn't respond. Hank dismounted, keeping a respectful distance. He was a tall man of 32 years, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with a sun-weathered face that had seen its share of hardship but retained a gentleness around the eyes. He led Penny forward a few steps. "How long have you been walking?" he asked, noticing the blisters visible through her torn shoes and the way she clutched a small bundle to her chest. She wet her cracked lips before speaking. "Since yesterday afternoon." Her voice was hoarse, barely audible, left Auburn after. She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "That's near 20 miles, Hank said, unable to hide his surprise. "You walked through the night." She nodded once, then seemed to lose her balance. Hank moved quickly, catching her arm before she could fall. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her mid-20s, and that what he'd taken for a bundle of possessions was actually a small leather satchel clutched tightly in her white-knuckled hands. "Miss, you need water and rest. My ranch is just a couple miles ahead. I can take you there, give you a proper meal." When she hesitated, he added, "Or I can escort you to town if you'd prefer, but you look about ready to collapse." She studied him, measuring his words against some internal scale. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Out here we help folks in need," Hank replied simply. "It's how we survive. I'm Hank Xavier. I run the Double X Ranch." A moment of silence passed between them before she spoke again. "Clara," she said. "Clara Caldwell." "Well, Miss Caldwell, what'll it be, my ranch or town?" Clara glanced down the dusty road toward Grass Valley, then back at Hank. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of risks, the consideration of limited options. "Your ranch," she finally said. "Just until I can gather my strength." Hank nodded, not pushing for explanations she clearly wasn't ready to give. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing to Penny. "It's been some time, but yes." He helped her onto the saddle, noting how light she was as he lifted her, then mounted behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. As they rode, he felt her gradually relax against him, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her caution. "Who are you running from?" he asked quietly, her body tensed immediately. "What makes you think I'm running? 20 miles on foot, through the night, with nothing but what you can carry. You're either running from something or to something mighty important." Clara was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so softly he almost missed it, "My husband." Hank didn't press further. The word husband and the fear in her voice when she said it told him enough for now. They continued in silence, the rhythmic sound of Penny's hooves on the packed dirt road the only conversation between them. The Double X Ranch came into view, as they crested a gentle hill, a sprawling property with a modest but well-maintained two-story farmhouse, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the distance. Morning activity was already underway. A young man was feeding chickens near the coop, and smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. "It's not much," Hank said, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, and something in her tone made him think she hadn't known a real home in quite some time. As they approached the house, a woman in her 50s emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered face broke into a smile that quickly transformed into concern when she spotted Clara. "Martha," Hank called as he dismounted, then carefully helped Clara down. "This is Miss Caldwell. She's had a long journey and needs some looking after." Martha hurried forward, her motherly instincts clearly engaged. "Lord have mercy, child, you look half dead on your feet. Come inside, come inside. I've got breakfast nearly ready and you can wash up." Clara hesitated, looking from Martha to Hank with uncertainty. "Martha's been our housekeeper since I was a boy," Hank explained. "You're in good hands with her." "The best hands," Martha corrected with a sniff. "Now come along, dear, let's get you settled." Clara allowed herself to be led inside, throwing one last glance over her shoulder at Hank, who tipped his hat to her reassuringly. As they disappeared into the house, Hank led Penny to the stable, his thoughts lingering on the mysterious woman and what kind of trouble might be following her. Inside the farmhouse, Martha clucked and fussed over Clara, showing her to a small but clean bedroom on the second floor. "This was Hank's sister's room," Martha explained, pulling fresh linens from a chest. "She's married and living in Sacramento now. You rest here as long as you need." Clara stood in the center of the room, looking lost. "I don't want to impose. I can work for my keep. I'm good with cooking and sewing, and I can learn whatever else needs doing." Martha's expression softened. "Child, you look ready to drop. Work can wait until you've had food and rest." She pointed to a door across the hall. "Washroom's there. I'll bring up hot water and you can clean up while I finish breakfast." When Martha left, Clara finally allowed her shoulders to slump, the facade of strength crumbling now that she was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs trembling with fatigue. The room was simple but comfortable, a patchwork quilt on the bed, curtains fluttering at the open window, a small dressing table with a mirror. It was more comfort than she'd known in years. She opened her satchel, taking inventory of her meager possessions. A change of clothes, a small pouch containing $37, every cent she'd been able to secretly save over 3 years. A silver locket containing a tiny portrait of her parents, a folded map, and a small knife she'd taken from the kitchen before fleeing. Not much to show for a life, but it was all she had. After washing up and changing into her clean dress, faded blue calico that had seen better days, but at least wasn't coated in dust, Clara made her way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and bacon. In the kitchen, she found Martha at the stove and Hank seated at a large wooden table, talking quietly with the young man Clara had seen feeding chickens earlier. They all looked up when she entered, and Hank stood, gesturing to an empty chair. "Miss Caldwell, join us. This is Illy, he helps run the ranch." Illy, a lanky youth of perhaps 19 with a shock of red hair, nodded politely. "Madam, please call me Clara," she said, taking the offered seat. Martha placed a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of her. "Eat up, dear. You need your strength." Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but soon she was devouring the meal with undisguised hunger. No one commented. They simply continued their conversation about the day's work ahead, allowing her a measure of privacy in her desperate consumption. When she'd finally eaten her fill, Clara sat back, feeling more human than she had in days. "Thank you," she said, looking around the table. "I don't know what I would have done if Mr. Xavier hadn't found me this morning." "Hank," he corrected gently. "Just Hank." Clara nodded, meeting his eyes briefly before looking away. There was something disarming about his direct gaze that made her heart flutter strangely. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Hank continued. "But I reckon at some point you'll want to tell us what brings you to these parts, especially if there's trouble that might follow." Clara's hand instinctively went to her left wrist, where a faded bruise was still visible. The gesture wasn't lost on Hank, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I left my husband in Auburn," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that rose in her throat at the mere mention of him. "Victor Caldwell, he isn't a kind man." Hank exchanged a look with Martha, who pursed her lips in understanding. "He's also not a man who lets go of what he considers his," Clara continued, her fingers twisting in her lap. "If he discovers I've come this way—" "How would he know?" Illy asked. "Victor has friends, influential friends. He's a successful businessman, well respected in Auburn. No one would believe." She stopped, swallowing hard. "I've been planning this escape for months, waiting for him to leave on a business trip. I have 3 days before he returns, perhaps 4. By then, I need to be far away." "Where are you headed?" Hank asked. "San Francisco, eventually. My cousin lives there. She's the only family I have left, but I need to work, save more money first. The stage fare alone would take most of what I have." Martha placed a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. "You can work here, dear, if that's what you want. We always need help, especially with harvest season coming." Clara looked up in surprise. "You do that? Even knowing my situation?" "Especially knowing your situation," Hank said firmly. "No woman should live in fear of her husband. You'll be safe here until you're ready to move on." For the first time since they'd met, Clara smiled, a small, tentative thing, but genuine. The transformation it wrought on her face was remarkable, lighting her gray eyes and revealing a dimple in her right cheek. Hank found himself momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll work hard, I promise." And so it was decided. Clara would stay at the XX ranch, helping Martha with the household duties while she regained her strength and saved money for her journey to San Francisco. What none of them could have predicted was how this arrangement would change all their lives in the weeks to come. The first few days passed in a blur for Clara. She slept more than she'd thought possible, her body desperately making up for months of tension and fear. When she wasn't sleeping, she threw herself into work with an energy that impressed even Martha. "Child, you don't need to exhaust yourself," Martha scolded one afternoon as Clara scrubbed the kitchen floor with vigorous determination. "This isn't a test," but in some ways it was. Clara needed to prove her worth, to show that taking her in wasn't a mistake. More than that, keeping busy helped quiet the constant fear that Victor would appear at any moment, his charming public smile giving way to the cold rage she knew too well. By the end of her first week at the ranch, Clara had settled into a routine. She rose early, helping Martha prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent the mornings cleaning, mending, or preserving the garden's summer bounty. In the afternoons, she often helped in the vegetable garden or gathered eggs from the henhouse. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, and gradually the haunted look in her eyes began to fade. Hank watched this transformation from a respectful distance. He was often out on the range with the cattle or handling business matters, but he made a point to take meals at the house when possible. Slowly, he pieced together Clara's story through fragments she shared at the dinner table, how she'd been orphaned at 17, when influenza took her parents. How she'd met Victor Caldwell, a man 20 years her senior, when she was working as a shop girl in Sacramento. How he'd seemed kind and generous during their brief courtship, only to reveal his true nature after their wedding 3 years ago. He was careful, she explained one evening as she and Martha shelled peas on the front porch, unaware that Hank was within earshot just around the corner. He never left marks where people could see, and he was so respected in town, the bank president's nephew, a church deacon. Who would believe me? Men like that, Martha said with quiet fury, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. My sister was married to such a man. She didn't leave until he broke her arm. Clara nodded. The night before he left on his trip, it was worse than usual. He was drinking, angry about some business deal. When I brought him his dinner too late, her voice faltered. I thought he might kill me. That's when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Hank had heard enough. He moved away silently, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The idea of someone hurting Clara made a dangerous rage simmer in his blood, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the war. It troubled him how quickly he'd grown protective of her, how often he found himself watching her as she hung laundry or tended the garden, her dark hair catching the sunlight. These feelings were complicated by the fact that she was, technically, a married woman. Hank was a man who lived by a strict moral code, and developing feelings for another man's wife, no matter how despicable that man might be, went against everything he believed. Besides, Clara had made it clear her plan was to continue to San Francisco as soon as possible. Yet as July turned to August, Clara showed no signs of hurrying her departure. The money she earned working at the ranch, Hank insisted on paying her a fair wage despite her initial protests, was carefully saved in her satchel, but she seemed in no rush to use it for stage fare. San Francisco isn't going anywhere, she said when Martha gently inquired about her plans one evening. And I feel safe here. The way her eyes had flickered briefly to Hank when she said this didn't escape Martha's notice, nor did the slight flush that colored her cheeks. Martha, who had worked for the Xavier family since Hank was a boy, recognized the signs all too well. The girl was falling for Hank, whether she admitted it to herself or not, and Hank, for all his attempts to maintain a respectful distance, was just as smitten. Martha saw it in the way he lingered at the breakfast table, how he found excuses to be near the house when Clara was working in the garden, the way his eyes followed her movements when he thought no one was looking. It was a dangerous situation, Martha knew. Not just because of Clara's marital status, but because of the threat her husband still posed. Though they hadn't heard any news of Victor Caldwell searching for his wife, Martha wasn't fooled into thinking he'd simply let her go. Men like that didn't surrender what they considered their property without a fight. Her concerns proved justified one hot afternoon in mid-August. Clara was alone in the house, Martha having gone to town for supplies, when the sound of an approaching carriage drew her to the window. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the two men climbing down, not Victor, thank God, but she recognized one as Sheriff Donovan from Auburn, who dined at her house more than once as Victor's friend. Clara retreated from the window, panic rising in her throat. They'd found her. Somehow they'd traced her to the Double X. Her mind raced. Should she run, hide? But where? The ranch was isolated, surrounded by open land. She'd never make it to the woods before they spotted her. A firm knock at the door made her jump. "Hello, anyone home?" a deep voice called. "Sheriff Donovan from Auburn County." Clara pressed herself against the wall beside the window, trying to control her breathing. If she stayed absolutely silent, perhaps they'd think no one was home and leave. "We're looking for a Mrs. Clara Caldwell," the sheriff continued. "Her husband's mighty worried about her. Says she wandered off in a confused state. The poor man's beside himself. Clara bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. A confused state that would be Victor's explanation for her disappearance, painting her as unstable, possibly even dangerous to herself. It was Clever, who would question a concerned husband searching for his disturbed wife. The knocking came again, more insistent. "We know somebody's staying here that fits her description. Just want to make sure she's all right." Clara's gaze fell on the back door. Perhaps if she slipped out quietly, she could make it to the barn and hide until they left. But as she inched toward the kitchen, the sound of horses approaching from the direction of the pastures froze her in place. Through the kitchen window, she saw Hank riding toward the house, Illy and another ranch hand following behind. They'd seen the unfamiliar carriage and were coming to investigate. Clara's heart sank. What would Hank do? Would he give her away, not wanting trouble with the law? She couldn't hear the exchange from inside, but she watched through a crack in the curtains as Hank dismounted and approached the sheriff and his deputy. There was a brief conversation, with much gesturing toward the house. Hank's posture remained relaxed, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. After what seemed an eternity, the sheriff and his companion returned to their carriage. Hank stood watching until they disappeared down the road, then turned toward the house. Clara met him at the door, her face pale. "They're gone," he said simply. "Told them I hadn't seen anyone matching your description, that we hire seasonal workers but none recently arrived from Auburn." "They didn't believe you," Clara said, not a question but a statement. "Doesn't matter what they believe. They have no authority to search my property without a warrant and no cause to get one." He studied her face. "But they'll be back, or others will come. Your husband isn't giving up easily." Clara sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "What did they tell you?" Hank's expression darkened. "That you're mentally unstable, that you attacked your husband with a kitchen knife before fleeing, that he's worried sick about your welfare." He paused. "Is any of that true?" "The knife part, yes," Clara admitted, looking down at her hands. "Not the way they told it, but yes, I took a knife. I was afraid. The rest is lies." Hank nodded as if this confirmed what he already knew. "They're staying in Grass Valley overnight, asking questions. Martha will have heard by the time she returns from town." "I should leave," Clara said, rising. "I've brought trouble to your door. I never meant you're not going anywhere," Hank interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "At least not until we have a proper plan. Running blindly now is exactly what they want you, alone, vulnerable, easy to catch." "But if they come back, let them," Hank said with a conviction that made Clara stare. "This is my land, my home. I decide who stays and who goes." He softened slightly. "Besides, I doubt they'll return so quickly. I made it clear that pressing the issue would be unwise." Clara could imagine how imposing Hank must have appeared to the sheriff, tall, strong, with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own authority. Still, she knew Victor. He wouldn't be deterred so easily, especially now that he had a lead on her whereabouts. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "We wait," Hank replied. "We're careful and we think about getting you legally free of that man." Clara's head snapped up. "A divorce? That's nearly impossible, especially for a woman, and even if I could, Victor would never agree." "There are other ways," Hank said. "I have a friend in Sacramento, a lawyer. I'll write to him today, ask for his advice." "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Taking these risks for me?" Hank looked at her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because no one deserves to live in fear," he said finally. "And because he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Because it's the right thing to do." He turned to leave, but Clara caught his arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me." His hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring. "Get some rest. We'll talk more when Martha returns." That night, after a tense discussion around the dinner table, they agreed that Clara would stay at the ranch but take extra precautions. She wouldn't go into town, would remain out of sight when strangers visited, and would always have someone nearby. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer than her striking out alone with Victor and his allies actively searching. The next week passed in an uneasy quiet. There was no sign of the sheriff or his deputy returning, but the knowledge that they were looking for her cast a shadow over Clara's days. She found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, watching the road anxiously whenever she was outside. Hank, true to his word, wrote to his lawyer friend in Sacramento and received a response within days. The news wasn't encouraging divorces were difficult to obtain, especially for women, and required either proof of extreme cruelty or abandonment, both hard to establish without witnesses or evidence. There might be another option, Hank said carefully as they sat on the porch one evening, the letters spread between them. If you were to go to a territory like Nevada or Arizona, the residence requirements for divorce are shorter and the courts less concerned with proof. Clara considered this. How would I get there? And how would I live while waiting for residence? I could help with that, Hank said. I have some money saved and contacts in Virginia City who might offer work. I couldn't accept such charity, Clara protested. You've done too much already. It's not charity, Hank insisted. It's a loan if that makes you feel better. You can repay me when you're settled. Clara studied his face in the fading light. There was something he wasn't saying, something behind his offer that she couldn't quite read. And what about you? She asked softly. What happens to you if Victor discovers you've helped me escape? Hank's expression hardened. Let him come. I've faced worse than men like Victor Caldwell. Clara believed him. Though Hank rarely spoke of it, she knew from Martha that he'd fought in the war, serving with distinction in the Union Army. The few times he'd mentioned those years, his eyes had taken on a haunted quality that suggested he'd seen horrors he preferred not to revisit. I won't have you fighting my battles, Clara said firmly. I got myself into this marriage. I'll find my own way out. Hank looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded, respecting her decision. Just remember you're not alone anymore, he said. Whatever you decide. Those words stayed with Clara long after they'd said goodnight. Not alone anymore. For 3 years, she'd been utterly alone despite living with a husband in a house often full of guests. Victor had systematically isolated her from friends, controlled her every movement, made her dependent on him for everything. The realization that she now had people Hank, Martha, even young Ellie who genuinely cared about her welfare was overwhelming. But with that comfort came new complications. Chief among them were her growing feelings for Hank Xavier, feelings that both thrilled and terrified her. She was still a married woman, technically committing a sin merely by harboring thoughts of another man. Yet in her heart, she'd left her marriage the moment she'd walked away from Victor's house. The only ties binding her to him now were legal ones, not those of affection or commitment. More troubling was her uncertainty about Hank's feelings. He was kind, protective, even tender at times, but was that merely his nature, or did it signal deeper regard? And if he did care for her as more than a woman in distress, would he ever act on it while she remained another man's wife? These questions plagued Clara as August gave way to September, bringing cooler evenings and the first hints of autumn to the ranch. The threat of Victor's pursuit seemed to recede as weeks passed with no further sign of the sheriff or other searchers. Gradually, Clara began to relax, to hope that perhaps he had given up, found her too much trouble to chase. It was a false security that shattered one bright afternoon as Clara hung laundry in the yard. The sound of an approaching buggy drew her attention to the road, and her blood ran cold at the sight of the vehicle cresting the hill. Though still distant, she recognized it instantly, Victor's personal buggy, distinctive with its glossy black paint and brass fittings. Clara dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran for the house, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Martha was in town again, and Hank had ridden out at dawn to check on a broken section of fence in the north pasture. Only Illy and one other hand were nearby, working in the barn. She burst through the kitchen door, frantically searching for a place to hide, knowing it was futile. Victor would search every inch of the property. He'd never leave without what he came for. For a wild moment, she considered grabbing the rifle Hank kept above the fireplace. But she knew she could never shoot a man, not even Victor. The sound of the buggy pulling up outside galvanized her into action. Clara darted to her room, grabbed her satchel with her precious savings, and slipped back downstairs, intending to escape through the back door. But as she reached the kitchen, she heard voices in the yard, Victor's smooth, educated tone and Illy's younger, uncertain one. "Just looking for my wife," Victor was saying. "Poor woman's not well. Ran off weeks ago in a state of confusion." "Don't know nothing about any missing wife," Illy replied, and Clara silently blessed him for the lie. "Mr. Xavier hires all the help around here, and he ain't mentioned nothing about a woman from Auburn." "Is Xavier here?" Victor's voice hardened slightly. "I'd like to speak with him directly. He's out checking fences, won't be back till evening." There was a pause, and Clara held her breath, imagining Victor's calculating expression, the one he wore when deciding how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. "I see," he finally said. "Well, perhaps you wouldn't mind if I waited. It's a long ride back to town, and I'm quite parched." Clara could almost feel Illy's discomfort. The young man was loyal but inexperienced in dealing with men like Victor. "I suppose that'd be all right," he said reluctantly. "You can wait on the porch. I'll bring some water." Clara moved away from the window, her mind racing. The back door was her only option now, but once outside, where could she go? The barn was too obvious, the fields too exposed. The creek, she decided there was a dense thicket of willows about a quarter-mile behind the house where she could hide until Hank returned. Silently, she slipped through the back door and down the steps, keeping the house between herself and the front yard where Victor waited. She'd made it halfway across the kitchen garden when a voice froze her in her tracks. "Hello, Clara." She turned slowly to find Victor standing at the corner of the house, watching her with the cold, satisfied smile she knew so well. He looked exactly as she remembered, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark beard neatly trimmed, his posture perfect. Only someone who knew him intimately would notice the dangerous glint in his eyes. "Did you think I wouldn't find you?" he asked conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Did you think you could simply walk away from our marriage vows?" Clara straightened her shoulders, determined not to cower despite the fear coursing through her. "I'm not going back with you, Victor," he laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. "Of course you are, my dear. You're my wife. Your place is by my side." He stepped closer. "I've been very patient, Clara. I've given you time to come to your senses, but my patience is at an end." "I'll scream," she warned as he took another step toward her. "The ranch hands will hear." "That boy," Victor scoffed. "I've sent him to the barn for feed for my horse. We're quite alone." He glanced at the satchel clutched in her hand. "Planning another escape? How disappointing. I thought you might have learned your lesson." Clara backed away, her mind frantically searching for options. The law," Victor interrupted smoothly, "recognizes a husband's right to discipline his wife. The law will help me bring you home, not keep you from me." His smile thinned. "But I'd rather not involve outsiders in our private affairs, Clara. It reflects poorly on both of us." He lunged suddenly, grabbing her arm with bruising force. Clara reacted instinctively, swinging her satchel at his head with all her strength. The heavy bag connected with his temple, stunning him momentarily. She wrenched free and ran, not toward the creek as she'd planned, but toward the barn where she knew Illy would be. She'd nearly reached the barn door when Victor caught her, tackling her to the ground with such force that the air was knocked from her lungs. Clara gasped, struggling beneath his weight as he pinned her down, his face contorted with rage. "You stupid, ungrateful woman," he hissed, one hand closing around her throat. "After everything I've given you," the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked cut through the air. "Get your hands off her," Hank's voice commanded, cold as steel. Victor's grip loosened as he turned his head to see Hank standing 10 feet away, rifle aimed steadily at his chest. Slowly, Victor rose to his feet, keeping his hands visible. "This is a private matter between a husband and his wife," he said, his voice regaining its cultured calm despite the situation. "I don't believe it concerns you, sir." Hank's expression didn't change. "When a man attacks a woman on my property, it very much concerns me." He shifted his gaze briefly to Clara. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, climbing shakily to her feet, one hand rubbing her throat where Victor's fingers had left red marks. "I'm all right." "Good." Hank returned his attention to Victor. "You need to leave. Now." Victor straightened his jacket, his eyes calculating. "This woman is my lawfully wedded wife, and I have every right to take her home. Interfere and you're breaking the law." "Maybe," Hank conceded, "but you'll still have to go through me to do it." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Clara could see Victor measuring Hank, assessing whether this was a fight he could win. Victor was not a physical man. He preferred to battle with words and influence rather than fists. Faced with Hank's obvious strength and the unwavering rifle, he evidently decided retreat was the wiser option. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll leave for now, but don't think this is over." He turned to Clara. "I'll be staying at the Grass Valley Hotel. Consider carefully, my dear. Come back willingly and I'll forgive this indiscretion. Force me to involve the authorities and things will go much harder for you and your friends." With that parting threat, he turned and walked back toward his waiting buggy, his posture rigid with suppressed fury. Clara didn't realize she was shaking until Hank lowered his rifle and moved to her side. "He's bluffing," Hank said quietly. "He can't force you to go with him, not from my land." "You don't know him," Clara whispered. "He never makes empty threats. He has friends in the territorial government, in the courts. He'll find a way." Hank's jaw tightened. "Then we'll find a way to stop him, but first, let's get you inside." By the time they reached the house, Victor's buggy was disappearing down the road toward town. Clara sank into a kitchen chair, the events of the past hour catching up to her in a wave of exhaustion and delayed terror. "I thought he'd given up," she said, accepting the glass of water Hank offered. "I was a fool to think he would ever let me go." "You're not a fool," Hank said firmly. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met." He sat across from her, his expression grave. "But Clara, he's right about one thing: the law is on his side. As your husband, he has certain rights that will be difficult to challenge. So I have no choice. I either go back to him or spend my life running." "There's always a choice," Hank replied. "And I meant what I said about helping you get to Nevada for a divorce. We could leave tonight before he has time to organize any legal action." Clara stared at him. "We." "I wouldn't send you alone," Hank said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Not with him looking for you. But the ranch, your livelihood, Illy can manage things with Martha's help. It would only be until you're safely established." Clara searched his face, trying to understand the sacrifice he was offering to make for her. "Why would you do this?" Hank looked away briefly, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I care what happens to you, more than I should, perhaps." The admission hung between them, fraught with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Clara felt a rush of emotions so complex she couldn't begin to untangle them: hope, fear, longing, guilt. "I can't let you risk everything for me," she said finally. "There must be another way." Before Hank could respond, the sound of a horse approaching at speed drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Ellie riding hard toward the house, his expression urgent. Hank met him at the door. "Sheriff's in town asking about Mrs. Caldwell," Ellie reported breathlessly. "That man, her husband, he's with him. They're gathering men to come search the ranch proper with papers and everything." "A search warrant," Hank muttered. That was fast, even for a man with influence. He turned to Clara. "We're out of time. Get your things, only what you absolutely need." "We're leaving." "Leaving? Where?" "My family has a hunting cabin in the foothills about 20 miles east. It's remote, hard to find if you don't know where to look. We'll go there until I can arrange passage to Nevada." Clara hesitated only briefly before nodding. The idea of flight was terrifying, but less so than returning to Victor. "How long do we have?" "Not long. They'll be organized within the hour, here shortly after." While Clara hurried upstairs to gather her few possessions, Hank gave Ellie instructions what to tell the sheriff, how to manage the ranch in his absence, who to contact in case of emergency. When Clara returned with her satchel, Hank had already packed provisions and saddled 2 horses. "I've left a note for Martha explaining everything," he said, helping Clara mount a gentle gray mare. "Ready?" Clara looked back at the farmhouse that had become a sanctuary over the past weeks, wondering if she'd ever see it again. "Ready," she confirmed, though her heart hammered with uncertainty. They rode east, avoiding the main roads, following game trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The September afternoon was warm, the sky a clear, endless blue above them. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant ride. As it was, every distant sound made Clara tense, certain it was pursuit. Hank led the way confidently, occasionally glancing back to check on her, offering reassurance with a nod or a brief smile. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty ahead, Clara felt safer with him than she had in years. They rode for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from a flask of water Hank had brought. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, the terrain grew steeper, thickly forested with pine and cedar. The air cooled noticeably with the elevation gain. "Not much farther," Hank assured her as they picked their way along a narrow ridge. "The cabin's just beyond that stand of pines." Clara nodded, too tired for words. The emotional and physical strain of the day had left her drained, clinging to her saddle with sheer determination. When the small log cabin finally came into view, nestled in a clearing beside a tumbling stream, she could have wept with relief. The cabin was rustic but sturdy, built by Hank's father decades earlier as a retreat during hunting season. Inside was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a small cupboard stocked with basic supplies, and a narrow bed in one corner. It was humble but clean, and blessedly far from Victor Caldwell and his machinations. While Hank tended to the horses, securing them in a small lean-to beside the cabin, Clara built a fire in the fireplace, grateful for the practical skills she'd learned on the ranch. By the time Hank entered, stamping trail dust from his boots, the cabin was warming and Clara had found coffee and beans in the cupboard. "It's not much," Hank said, looking around as if seeing the cabin through her eyes. "But it's secure." "It's perfect," Clara replied sincerely. "Thank you for bringing me here." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a simple meal of beans, jerky, and hardtack from the provisions they'd brought. As they ate by firelight, Clara found herself studying Hank's face, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way the flickering light softened his weathered features. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Hank set down his tin cup. "Tomorrow I'll ride to the nearest town. There's a settlement about 10 miles north where I'm not known. I'll send a telegram to my friend in Sacramento, arrange for money and transportation to Nevada." He paused. "It might take a few days to organize everything safely." "And then you'll return to your ranch," something flickered in Hank's eyes. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether you want me to accompany you to Nevada." He held up a hand as she began to protest. "Not out of obligation, Clara, because I want to." Clara stared at him, heart pounding. "Why would you want to?" Hank was silent for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because in the weeks you've been at my ranch, something's changed. I've changed." He met her gaze directly. "I know it's wrong. I know you're married, that legally you belong to another man. But when I look at you, I don't see Victor Caldwell's wife. I see Clara, brave, kind, determined Clara who deserves so much more than what life has given her so far." Clara couldn't speak, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not asking for anything," Hank continued. "I have no right to. I'm just telling you that if you want me by your side until you're truly free, I'll be there, and after that." He trailed off, leaving the future unspoken. "After that," Clara whispered, finding her voice at last, "I would still be a divorced woman, damaged goods in the eyes of society. Not the kind of wife a respectable rancher should take." "I've never much cared what society thinks," Hank replied with the hint of a smile. "And the only thing that would damage you in my eyes is if you went back to a man who hurt you." Clara stood abruptly, moving to the cabin's small window to stare out at the night, trying to sort through the tangle of her emotions. She'd come to care deeply for Hank, perhaps even to love him, but she'd never allowed herself to hope for a future together. Even if she obtained a divorce, there would be whispers, disapproval. Hank's reputation might suffer. And if Victor contested the divorce, the process could drag on for years. "It's too much to ask of you," she said finally. "Too much risk, too much uncertainty." Hank moved to stand behind her, close but not touching. "Clara," he said softly, "look at me." She turned reluctantly, finding his face just inches from hers. "I've lived through a war," he said. "I've seen men die for causes less worthy than love. What risk is a little gossip compared to that?" "Love," Clara repeated, the word barely audible. Hank nodded slowly. "Yes," he said simply. "Love." The declaration hung between them, transforming the small cabin into a space where only the two of them existed, where the complications of the outside world momentarily fell away. Clara felt something break free inside her, a final chain that had bound her to her past, to Victor, to a life of fear. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both frightening and liberating. "God help me, I do." Hank's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then we'll find a way forward, together." When his lips met hers, it was like nothing Clara had ever experienced, tender, reverent, a promise rather than a demand. She melted into the kiss, into his embrace, feeling for the first time in years that she was exactly where she belonged. That night, though propriety dictated distance, they slept side by side on the narrow bed, fully clothed but holding each other against the mountain chill. No lines were crossed, no vows broken beyond those already shattered by Victor's cruelty. But something new was forged between them, a bond that went beyond physical desire to something deeper and more enduring. Dawn found them both awake, watching pink light filter through the cabin's small window, neither willing to break the peaceful moment with words. Finally, Hank rose, preparing for his ride to the settlement while Clara made coffee and a simple breakfast from their provisions. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised as he saddled his horse. "Bar the door while I'm gone and use this if necessary." He handed her his revolver, showing her how to cock and fire it. "There's no reason anyone should find this place, but better safe than sorry." Clara nodded, tucking the weapon into her pocket. "Be careful," she urged. "Victor has eyes everywhere." "I'll be careful," Hank assured her. He leaned down from his saddle to kiss her once more, briefly but firmly. "One day at a time, remember, today's task is information and arrangements. Tomorrow we'll know more." Clara watched him ride away, following the narrow trail until he disappeared among the pines. The day stretched before her, long and solitary. She kept busy cleaning the cabin, washing clothes in the stream, gathering firewood from the nearby forest. The physical activity helped calm her mind, preventing her from dwelling too much on the uncertainties ahead. As afternoon waned with no sign of Hank's return, however, anxiety began to gnaw at her. He'd promised to be back by nightfall. The lengthening shadows in the clearing made her increasingly uneasy. Had something happened? Had Victor somehow intercepted him? By the time full darkness fell, Clara was pacing the small cabin, pausing frequently at the window to peer out at the moonlit clearing. The revolver Hank had left was a reassuring weight in her pocket, though the idea of actually using it terrified her. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Clara stood frozen by the door, the revolver in her trembling hand, until Hank's voice called softly, "It's me, Clara." She flung the door open to find him dismounting wearily, his expression grim. "What happened?" she asked as he led his horse to the lean-to. "I was worried sick. Had to take the long way back," he explained, unsaddling his mount with practiced efficiency. Spotted riders on the main trail couldn't tell who they were, but wasn't taking chances. Inside the cabin, as he warmed himself by the fire Clara had kept burning, he elaborated. "I sent the telegram to my friend in Sacramento. He'll wire money to a bank in Truckee that's a town near the Nevada border. We can collect it there in 3 days." He paused. "I also heard news in town. Your husband's offered a reward for information on your whereabouts, $500. Clara paled. "That's a fortune." "Yes," Hank agreed grimly. "Enough to tempt a lot of people. We need to move quickly before someone connects me to your disappearance. How will we get to Truckee?" "There's a stage that runs east from Pine Grove. That's the settlement I visited today. It leaves day after tomorrow. If we ride out at dawn, we can make it in time." Clara nodded, trying to absorb the plan. "And from Truckee to Virginia City?" "Another stage, or we can hire a private conveyance with the money my friend is sending." Hank took her hands in his. "Once in Virginia City, you can file for divorce. Nevada territory only requires 6 months residence." 6 months, Clara repeated. "And then?" Hank's thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "And then, if you're willing, we can be married. Properly, legally, in the eyes of God and man." The simplicity of his proposal, so different from Victor's elaborate courtship with its hidden agendas, brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'm willing." They spent the next day preparing for their journey, packing the few provisions they could carry, planning their route to Pine Grove, discussing contingencies if they were separated. Through it all, there was a new current between them, a certainty that they were moving not just away from danger but toward something precious. That night, as they lay together on the narrow bed, Hank spoke softly of his dreams for their future, the ranch they would build together, the family they might have, the life they would share. Clara listened, allowing herself for the first time in years to imagine a future filled with love rather than fear. "It won't be easy," Hank cautioned. "There will be talk, judgment. Some people won't understand or approve." "Let them talk," Clara replied with newfound confidence. "We'll know the truth, that's what matters." They set out before dawn the next morning, a pale moon still visible as they rode single file down the narrow mountain trail. The journey to Pine Grove would take most of the day, even pushing the horses as much as they dared. Neither spoke much as they rode, conserving energy, each lost in private thoughts. By midday, they had descended from the mountains into gentler foothills, following a little-used trail that wound through oak groves and open meadows. They stopped briefly by a stream to rest the horses and eat a cold meal of jerky and hardtack. "We're making good time," Hank observed, studying the sun's position. "Should reach Pine Grove well before dark." Clara nodded, stretching her stiff muscles. The journey was taking its toll. She wasn't accustomed to such long rides. But the prospect of reaching safety, of beginning their journey to Nevada, and a new life kept her determined. They had just remounted when Hank suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. Clara froze, listening. In the distance, she could hear it too, the rhythmic thud of approaching horses, at least 3 or 4, moving at a steady pace along the trail ahead of them. "Off the trail," Hank whispered urgently, guiding his mount into the denser trees to their right. Clara followed, her heart pounding as they concealed themselves some 30 yards from the path, behind a screen of manzanita bushes. Minutes later, 4 riders appeared, 3 men Clara didn't recognize, and at their head, Victor Caldwell. They moved at an unhurried pace, scanning the surroundings with practiced eyes. These weren't casual travelers, they were searching methodically. "The guide said the cabin's about 5 miles north of here," one man was saying as they passed. "Hidden in a pine grove near a creek. And Xavier uses it regularly." Victor's voice carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "According to folks in Grass Valley, yes. Hunting mostly, but he's been known to disappear there when he wants solitude." "Then that's where we'll find my wife," Victor said with cold certainty. "And her. Protect her." Clara and Hank remained motionless until long after the riders had passed, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. Only when silence had returned did Hank finally speak. "They're heading for the cabin," he said unnecessarily. "We have a few hours at most before they realize we're not there and double back." "How did they know?" Clara whispered, shaken by the close call. "About the cabin, about us. Money talks," Hank replied grimly. $500 buys a lot of information, and I'm not exactly unknown in these parts." He considered their options briefly. "We need to change course. They'll expect us to head for the nearest town or stage stop. So we don't go to Pine Grove. No. We head west, then swing south toward Sacramento. It's a longer journey, but there are more places to lose ourselves, more options for transportation." Clara nodded, trusting his judgment. "How far to Sacramento?" 2 days hard riding if we push it. But we'll need to stop in smaller towns along the way to rest the horses and ourselves." With that decision made, they set off again, cutting cross-country away from established trails, using Hank's knowledge of the terrain to navigate toward the western foothills. The going was slower, more difficult, but the reduced risk of encounter was worth the extra effort. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 15 miles, reaching a small creek where they made a cold camp, no fire, just a simple meal of their dwindling provisions before settling down to sleep under the stars, taking turns keeping watch. Clara's turn came in the deepest part of night, when even the nocturnal creatures had fallen silent. She sat with Hank's revolver in her lap, watching his sleeping form in the faint moonlight, struck by how peaceful he looked despite the danger surrounding them. In that moment, she made a silent vow she would not be the cause of his destruction. If it came to a choice between his safety and her freedom, she would choose his safety, even if it meant returning to Victor. But she prayed it wouldn't come to that. They continued their journey at first light, pushing harder now that they knew Victor was actively tracking them. The terrain gradually changed from forested foothills to gentler country as they moved westward, making for easier riding but less cover. By mid-afternoon, they spotted a small settlement in the distance, a cluster of buildings that looked to be a mining camp or supply station. "We need supplies," Hank said, studying the settlement through narrowed eyes. "And the horses need rest. I'll go in alone, you wait here." Clara shook her head firmly. "We stay together. If something happens, I won't be left wondering." After a brief argument, Hank reluctantly agreed. They approached the settlement cautiously, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings centered around what appeared to be a general store and saloon. A weathered sign proclaimed it, "Miners Rest ESD, 1852. The few people visible, mostly rough-looking men with the lean, hardened look of career miners, paid them little attention as they dismounted in front of the general store. Inside, a gray-haired man with spectacles greeted them with mild curiosity. "Don't get many strangers this time of year," he observed as Hank purchased basic supplies, food, ammunition, a blanket. "You folks passing through?" "Just headed south," Hank replied non-committally. "Any chance there's a place to rest for a few hours? The horses are tired." "Widow Jenkins rents rooms above the saloon," the storekeeper offered. "Nothing fancy, mind you, but clean enough." A few hours proper rest in a real bed was too tempting to resist. After securing a room from the businesslike Widow Jenkins, who asked no questions beyond whether they needed one bed or two, Clara and Hank took turns bathing with a basin of heated water while the other kept watch. "We'll leave before dawn," Hank said as they shared a simple meal in their room. "Should reach Sacramento by tomorrow night if all goes well." Clara nodded, fighting exhaustion. The past days had taken more from her than she'd realized. The prospect of a few hours' sleep in a real bed was almost overwhelming. "Get some rest," Hank urged, seeing her fatigue. "I'll keep first watch." She didn't argue, sinking gratefully onto the narrow bed and falling almost instantly into deep sleep. It seemed only moments later when Hank's hand on her shoulder woke her, his expression tense. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. "Now." Clara was instantly alert, reaching for her boots. "What's happened?" "Riders just arrived, 4 of them. Can't see clearly in the dark, but one matches Victor's build." They gathered their few possessions silently, slipping out of the room and down the back stairs that led to a small yard behind the saloon. Their horses, thankfully, were stabled nearby. As Hank quietly saddled them, Clara kept watch, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. They were just leading the horses from the stable when a voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness. "That's far enough." Victor stepped into view from behind a stack of crates, a revolver gleaming dully in his hand. He was alone, at least for the moment, but Clara had no doubt his companions were nearby. "Hello, Clara," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "It's time to come home." Hank moved protectively in front of Clara. "She's not going anywhere with you, Caldwell." Victor's laugh was cold. "And who's going to stop me?" "You, 1 man against 4. He raised his voice slightly. "Gentlemen, our quarry is attempting to depart." Heavy footsteps approached from multiple directions, Victor's hired men closing in. Clara felt panic rising, threatening to overwhelm her. They were trapped. "Victor," she said, stepping out from behind Hank despite his attempt to keep her shielded. "Let Hank go. This is between you and me." Victor's eyes narrowed. "So it's Hank now, is it? How touching." He gestured with his revolver. "Step away from him, Clara. Now." "Don't do it," Hank warned in a low voice. He'll shoot me anyway. Perceptive, Victor acknowledged. But I'm a businessman, not a murderer. I have no desire to hang for killing you, Xavier. All I want is my wife returned to me. She's not property, Hank growled. The law says otherwise. Victor's attention shifted to Clara. One last chance. Come with me willingly and your friend lives. Refuse, and I cannot guarantee his safety. Clara saw the three other men, now rough characters with the hard eyes of men who killed for money. They had Hank and her surrounded, weapons drawn. There was no escape, no clever plan that could extract them from this situation. If I go with you, she said carefully, what happens to Hank? Victor shrugged. He goes his way, you go yours. A clean separation. And you expect me to believe that, after you've tracked us across half the county? Believe what you like, Victor replied coldly. But consider this, my men are growing impatient and accidents happen so easily in the dark. As if to emphasize his point, one of the men cocked his pistol loudly. Clara flinched at the sound, seeing in her mind's eye the bullet that would end Hank's life if she made the wrong choice. Time's up, Clara, Victor said. What's it going to be? Clara looked at Hank, memorizing his face in the dim light, the strong line of his jaw, the quiet determination in his eyes, the gentle strength that had become her sanctuary. I'm sorry, she whispered. Clara, don't, Hank began, but she cut him off. I have to, she said softly. Then more loudly, I'll go with you, Victor. Just let Hank leave unharmed. Victor's smile was triumphant. A wise decision, my dear, he gestured to his men. Escort Mr. Xavier to his horse. Make sure he rides north away from town. As one of the men roughly grabbed Hank's arm, Clara moved to Victor's side, her heart breaking with each step. I'll need my satchel, she said, gesturing to the bag still attached to her saddle. Victor nodded permission and Clara retrieved it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Inside was everything she owned in the world, including Hank's revolver, still loaded with 6 bullets. Clara, Hank called as he was forced onto his horse. This isn't over. I'll find a way. Enough, Victor snapped, signaling his man to move Hank along. Be grateful you're leaving with your life, Xavier. Clara watched in anguish as Hank was escorted away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Only when he was gone did Victor turn to her, his expression hardening. Now, he said, gripping her arm painfully, we have some matters to discuss regarding wifely obedience. Clara allowed herself to be led to Victor's waiting carriage, her mind racing. She had made her choice to save Hank's life, but she was far from defeated. She had the revolver, she had her wits, and most importantly, she had a love worth fighting for. Victor might have won this encounter, but the war was far from over. The journey back to Auburn was conducted in tense silence. Victor, seated opposite Clara in the carriage, watched her with cold calculation, while 2 of his hired men rode alongside as escorts. The third had been sent to ensure Hank truly left the area. You've led me on quite a chase, Victor said eventually as the rolling hills of the gold country stretched around them. Very inconvenient, very embarrassing. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm not coming back to stay, Victor. This changes nothing. He laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. Oh, but it changes everything, my dear. You've proven yourself unstable, unreliable. No judge would grant you independence now, not after you've run away with another man. There was nothing improper between Hank and me, Clara insisted, though the memory of their shared kisses burned in her mind. The appearance is what matters, Victor replied smoothly. And speaking of appearances, you should know that I've taken steps to ensure you won't find it so easy to flee again. The house has new locks on the outside of your door, and I've hired a woman to attend you day and night for your own protection, of course. Clara felt cold dread settle in her stomach. Prison, he was describing a prison. "You can't keep me locked up forever," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Not forever," Victor agreed. "Just until you remember your duty as a wife, until you're properly contrite." The threat behind his words was unmistakable. Clara turned away, staring out the carriage window at the passing landscape, her hand instinctively moving to the satchel beside her, where Hank's revolver lay hidden. 6 bullets. One for each of Victor's men, one for Victor himself, and one she prayed she wouldn't need to use on herself if all else failed. They reached Auburn by nightfall, the town's lights twinkling in the valley below as they descended the final hill. Clara felt a surge of panic as familiar streets appeared, leading inexorably to the grand house on Pine Street where she had endured 3 years of quiet torment. The carriage pulled up to the front entrance, where a stern-faced woman in a dark dress waited on the porch. "Mrs. Caldwell," she greeted Clara with a curt nod as Victor helped her down from the carriage. "I'm Mrs. Blackett. I'll be your companion." "Jailer," Clara translated mentally, taking in the woman's hard eyes and rigid posture. Victor had chosen well. Mrs. Blackett looked like she'd tolerate no nonsense. "Take Mrs. Caldwell to her room," Victor instructed. "She's had a trying journey and needs rest. Ensure she has everything she requires within reason, of course." The bedroom that had once been Clara's prison now looked the part more explicitly, with heavy curtains nailed to the window frames and a new lock installed on the outside of the door. Mrs. Blackett watched from the doorway as Clara set her satchel on the bed. "Supper will be brought up shortly," the companion said. "Mr. Caldwell suggests you might want to bathe and change before he visits you later this evening." The implied threat in those words sent a chill through Clara. "I'm very tired," she said, feigning greater exhaustion than she felt. "Please tell my husband I'll see him in the morning." Mrs. Blackett's expression didn't change. "I'll convey your request, but Mr. Caldwell sets his own schedule." When the woman finally left, locking the door behind her, Clara allowed herself a moment of pure despair. She sank onto the edge of the bed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. After everything, after finding love, finding hope, to end up back where she started seemed too cruel to bear. But as the tears subsided, determination took their place. She was not the same woman who had fled this house weeks ago. That woman had been alone, uncertain, desperate. This woman had known love, had tasted freedom, had discovered her own strength. And she had something the previous Clara had lacked: a plan. Moving quietly, she unpacked her satchel, hiding the revolver beneath her mattress where it would be accessible but not immediately visible. Then she washed quickly with the basin of water provided, changing into the nightgown that had been laid out for her, one of Victor's choosing, with its too low neckline and impractical lace. As she brushed her hair, she thought of Hank. Was he safe? Would he truly ride away as Victor had ordered, or would he seek help? She couldn't count on rescue. She had to assume she was on her own. The sound of the key turning in the lock pulled her from her thoughts. Victor entered, still dressed in his traveling clothes but freshly washed, his beard neatly trimmed. He carried a glass of brandy, which he sipped as he surveyed her. "You look better," he observed. "More like my wife and less like a vagrant." Clara remained seated at her dressing table, watching him in the mirror. "What do you want, Victor? Such hostility," he chided, setting his glass down and moving behind her. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, heavy and possessive. "Is that any way to greet your husband after your adventure?" Clara forced herself to remain still, though every instinct screamed to pull away from his touch. "I'm tired," she said flatly. "Whatever you have to say can wait until morning." Victor's fingers tightened painfully on her shoulders. "I decide what can wait," he said, his voice hardening. "You seem to have forgotten that fundamental truth during your absence." Clara met his eyes in the mirror. "And you seem to have forgotten that I am a person, not a possession." The blow came swiftly, an open-handed slap that snapped her head to the side, leaving her cheek stinging. Clara gasped, more from shock than pain. Victor usually restrained himself to less visible forms of discipline. "You will learn respect again," he said coldly. "However long it takes, whatever methods are required." Clara straightened, touching her reddened cheek. "Is this how you intend to win back my affection? With violence and imprisonment?" "Affection," Victor laughed. "My dear, I don't require your affection, only your obedience." He stepped back, retrieving his brandy. "But perhaps you're right about one thing. This conversation can wait until you're rested. We have all the time in the world, after all." With that ominous promise, he left, the key turning once more in the lock. Clara released a shaky breath, her hand moving to her burning cheek. She had expected worse, much worse. That Victor had restrained himself suggested he was still concerned with appearances, still wanted to maintain the fiction of a respectable marriage. That gave her an advantage, however small. Clara slept fitfully that night, waking often to strain her ears for any sound in the silent house. By morning, she had formulated the beginnings of a plan, one that required patience, cunning, and perfect timing. The next week passed in a routine of careful observation and forced compliance. Clara outwardly accepted her captivity, taking meals in her room, allowing Mrs. Blackett to accompany her on brief, supervised walks in the garden, responding to Victor's visits with passive politeness. All the while, she gathered information. Mrs. Blackett, though stern, was not cruel and could be drawn into conversation with the right approach. From her, Clara learned that Victor left each morning at precisely 8:30 for his office in town, returning at 5. She also discovered that Mrs. Blackett took exactly 30 minutes to eat her midday meal in the kitchen, during which time Clara was locked in her room. Most importantly, she learned that Victor had scheduled a business trip to San Francisco for the following week, his first since her escape, though he planned to take Mrs. Blackett with him as an added precaution. Leaving Clara in the care of the housekeeper and a hired guard, it represented her best chance for escape. On the third night of her captivity, Clara was startled from sleep by a soft tapping at her window. Heart racing, she slipped from bed and peered through a gap in the nailed curtains. There, balanced precariously on the branch of the oak tree that grew beside the house, was Illy Hank's young ranch hand. Clara glanced anxiously at her locked door, then back at Illy. She couldn't open the window, it too was locked, but she could hear him if she pressed her ear to the glass. "Mr. Xavier sent me," Illy whispered when she approached. "He's nearby, planning. Wanted you to know you're not alone." Relief flooded Clara, so intense she nearly wept. "Victor has men watching the house," she warned. "It's too dangerous for you to be here." "We're being careful," Illy assured her. "Mr. Xavier's got friends helping good men who don't hold with how Caldwell's treating you. Tell Hank." Clara paused, overwhelmed by everything she wanted to say. "Tell him I have a plan. Victor's going to San Francisco next week. That's when I'll make my move." Illy nodded. "We'll be ready. There's a place Widow Parker's boarding house on the edge of town. If you can get there, she'll help." Before Clara could respond, a noise from the hallway made her freeze. "Go," she whispered urgently to Illy. "Someone's coming." The young man disappeared into the darkness just as Clara's door opened, revealing Mrs. Blackett in her nightgown, a lamp held high. "I heard voices," the companion said suspiciously, surveying the room. "Just a nightmare," Clara replied, forcing a tremulous smile. "I sometimes talk in my sleep when I'm distressed." Mrs. Blackett didn't look entirely convinced, but seemed unwilling to pursue the matter in the middle of the night. "Try to rest," she said before withdrawing, locking the door once more. Clara returned to bed, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Hank hadn't abandoned her. He was nearby, planning, waiting. All she needed to do was execute her escape and reach the widow Parker's boarding house. Then they could resume their journey to Nevada, to freedom, to a future together. The days that followed required all of Clara's acting abilities. She had to appear resigned to her fate, even as she secretly prepared for escape. She began complaining of headaches, establishing a pattern of taking medication that made her drowsy in the evenings. Medication she actually hid beneath her tongue and disposed of later. She also made a point of demonstrating increased docility toward Victor, responding to his commands with meek acquiescence, even initiating small gestures of wifely attention, pouring his evening brandy, inquiring about his business affairs. Though it sickened her to play this role, she saw the gradual thawing of his suspicion, the slight relaxation of security measures. By the time Victor's San Francisco trip arrived, Clara had earned enough trust that Mrs. Blackett sometimes left her door unlocked during the day when they were both inside the house. Victor, believing his wife suitably cowed, departed with confidence, taking Mrs. Blackett with him as planned, but seeing no need for additional guards beyond the regular housekeeper, and a man posted outside at night. Clara waited until evening, feigning one of her now familiar headaches and retiring early. The housekeeper brought her a light supper and her medicine, which Clara pretended to take before settling into bed. Once alone, she dressed quickly in her plainest dress, packed her few essentials, and retrieved the revolver from its hiding place. The lock on her bedroom door was substantial but simple. Using a hairpin she'd carefully modified over the past week, Clara worked patiently at the mechanism, remembering techniques she'd observed from a locksmith who'd once repaired a cabinet in her parents' home. After 20 minutes of painstaking effort, she was rewarded with a soft click as the lock gave way. The house was silent as she crept down the hallway, avoiding the third step from the bottom of the staircase that always creaked. The front door would be locked and possibly guarded, but the kitchen entrance used by servants and deliverymen was likely to be more accessible. Clara moved through the darkened house like a ghost, grateful for her intimate knowledge of its layout. In the kitchen, she found the door secured only by a simple bolt, which she slid open with trembling fingers. Outside, the night air was cool on her face, sweet with the scent of late summer flowers. Freedom was so close she could taste it. Keeping to the shadows, Clara made her way around the side of the house and through the garden gate that led to a narrow alley. From there, it was a tense half-mile walk to the edge of town, where Widow Parker's boarding house stood, a modest 2-story building with a discreet lamp burning in the front window. Clara approached cautiously, watching for any sign of pursuit or surveillance. The street appeared deserted. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the steps and knocked softly at the door. It opened almost immediately, revealing a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a practical expression. "Mrs. Caldwell?" she asked in a whisper. Clara nodded, relief making her knees weak. "Come in quickly," the woman urged, ushering her inside and bolting the door. "I'm Ellen Parker. Your friends are waiting." Clara followed Widow Parker through a narrow hallway to a small sitting room at the back of the house. There, rising from a chair beside the fire, was Hank. He looked tired, his face shadowed with stubble, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Clara," he breathed, crossing the room in 2 strides to gather her into his arms. She clung to him, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather, feeling truly safe for the first time since their separation. "You came back for me," she whispered against his chest. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Hank drew back slightly to look into her face, his expression incredulous. "Victor said you'd been sent away, and you believed him." Hank shook his head. "I rode away as ordered, then circled back as soon as his men were out of sight. I've been in Auburn ever since, watching, waiting, planning with Widow Parker and others who know the truth about Victor Caldwell." Clara looked around, noticing for the first time that they weren't alone. Illy stood by the window, keeping watch, while two other men she didn't recognize sat at a small table, studying what appeared to be a map. "This is Tom Whitley, the telegraph operator," Hank introduced one of the men, "and Sheriff James Cooper from Nevada County." Clara stared in surprise at the badge on the second man's vest. A sheriff. "But I thought not all lawmen are in Victor's pocket," Sheriff Cooper said, rising to tip his hat politely. "Some of us take exception to men who abuse their wives, no matter how wealthy or influential they might be." "Sheriff Cooper is an old friend," Hank explained. "We served together in the war. When I sent word about your situation, he came right away." "I can't arrest Caldwell not without evidence, and not in Auburn where he has the local law on his side," Cooper clarified. "But I can ensure you get safely out of his jurisdiction and into mine." "We're leaving tonight," Hank told Clara. "There's a wagon waiting behind the boarding house. We'll travel through the night, cross into Nevada County by morning, and be on a stage to Virginia City by noon tomorrow." Clara felt light-headed with the sudden turn of events. After days of planning her own desperate escape, to find such a well-organized rescue waiting for her seemed almost too good to be true. "What if Victor returns early?" she asked. "Or if someone raises the alarm when I'm found missing?" "That's why we move now," Cooper said firmly. "Every hour puts more distance between you and Auburn." There was no time to waste. Within minutes, Clara found herself bundled into the back of a covered wagon, nestled among blankets with Hank beside her. Sheriff Cooper and Tom would ride alongside as escorts, while Lily returned to the Double X Ranch to inform Martha that all had gone according to plan. As the wagon rumbled away from Auburn under the cover of darkness, Clara leaned against Hank's solid warmth, allowing herself to truly believe for the first time that escape was possible. Victor's reach, though long, was not infinite. With every mile, his power over her diminished. "I was so afraid I'd never see you again," she admitted softly as the town's lights receded behind them. Hank's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I made you a promise, Clara. I intend to keep it. Even after all this, the danger, the complications, especially after all this." He turned to face her in the dim light filtering through the wagon's canvas cover. "When Victor took you, I realized something I should have known all along, that I can't imagine my life without you in it. Not now, not ever." Clara's heart swelled with emotions too powerful for words. Instead of speaking, she leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her fear, hope, and love into the contact. Hank responded in kind, his hands gentle on her face as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Clara rested her forehead against his. "I love you, Hank Xavier," she whispered. "Whatever happens next, remember that." "I'll remember," he promised. "And I'll remind you every day for the rest of our lives." The journey to Nevada County passed without incident, the night hours melting away as Clara alternately dozed against Hank's shoulder and watched the landscape change through the back opening of the wagon. Dawn found them crossing the county line, the wagon descending into a valley where the town of Grass Creek lay nestled among pine-covered hills. "My jurisdiction now," Sheriff Cooper announced with satisfaction as they entered the town limits. "You're safe here, Mrs. Caldwell." They stopped at the sheriff's office, a modest building on the main street. Inside, Cooper offered them coffee while explaining the next steps. "The stage to Virginia City leaves at noon," he said, spreading a map across his desk. "It's a 2-day journey with an overnight stop at a way station here." He indicated a point along the route. "Once in Virginia City, you'll need to establish residence for 6 months before filing for divorce." 6 months, Clara repeated, looking at Hank. "That's a long time to put your life on hold." "I've already made arrangements," Hank said. "Illy and Martha will manage the ranch in my absence, and I have a cousin in Virginia City who owns a freight business. He's offered me work while we're there." Clara shook her head in wonder. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Hank admitted with a rueful smile. "Just the important parts." By noon, they were aboard the eastbound stage, Clara's heart lighter than it had been in years despite the uncertain future ahead. The knowledge that Hank was beside her, that they had a plan, that people were helping them, it filled her with a hope she'd nearly forgotten was possible. The journey to Virginia City was grueling, long hours of being jostled over rough roads, nights spent in basic accommodations, constant vigilance against potential pursuit. But there was also a freedom to it, a sense of adventure that Clara embraced. Each mile took her further from Victor's reach, closer to a new beginning. They arrived in Virginia City on a crisp September afternoon. The busy mining town sprawled across the slopes of Mount Davidson like a haphazard collection of wooden blocks. Despite its rough appearance, the place hummed with energy and prosperity, the famous Comstock lode still yielding enough silver to keep the economy booming. Hank's cousin, Patrick Xavier, met them at the stage depot, a burly, red-faced man with Hank's same directness, but a more boisterous manner. He welcomed Clara with genuine warmth, treating her without a hint of judgment. "Got you set up in a place on D Street," he told them as they loaded their few possessions into his wagon. "It's small, but clean, and the landlady's discreet. Asked no questions when I said my cousin and his intended needed lodgings." Clara glanced at Hank, who shrugged slightly. "Simpler explanation than the truth," he said. "We'll straighten it all out once the divorce is final." Their new home was indeed small, just 2 rooms above a millinery shop, with a shared bathroom down the hall, but to Clara, it was perfect. For the first time since leaving her parents' house, she had a space that felt like her own, where Victor's shadow didn't loom in every corner. The next 6 months passed in a blur of new experiences and cautious optimism. Hank worked for Patrick's freight company, driving supply wagons to outlying mining camps and neighboring settlements. Clara found employment at the millinery shop downstairs, discovering a talent for hat-making that surprised even herself. They lived modestly, saving every spare penny for legal fees and their eventual return to California. Though they maintained separate sleeping arrangements, Hank insisted on propriety. Until Clara's divorce was final, they spent every evening together, talking, reading, planning their future. Virginia City society proved less judgmental than they'd feared. In a booming mining town where fortunes rose and fell overnight and people reinvented themselves regularly, their story was hardly the most scandalous. The fact that they lived discreetly and worked hard earned them respect among their neighbors. Still, they remained vigilant. Victor's influence might not extend directly to Nevada territory, but his wealth and connections made him dangerous from any distance. Clara wrote regularly to Martha at the Double X Ranch. Using a coded system, they devised to communicate whether all was well without revealing specific details that might be intercepted. As winter descended on the mountains, bringing snow and bitter winds, their little apartment became a cozy haven. They celebrated Christmas quietly but joyfully, exchanging simple gifts and sharing a special dinner Clara prepared on their small stove. That night, sitting before the fire they'd built in the tiny hearth, Hank presented Clara with an unexpected package. "I've been saving for this," he said as she unwrapped the parcel to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal and fine pen. "I thought you might want to write your story someday, not just what happened with Victor, but everything that comes after, our story." Clara traced the journal's embossed cover, deeply moved by the gesture. "Our story," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "It's just beginning," Hank said, taking her hand. "The best parts are still ahead." February brought the 6-month milestone they'd been waiting for. With the help of a local attorney recommended by Sheriff Cooper, Clara filed her petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. The process was straightforward under Nevada's more liberal laws, requiring only proof of residence and sworn testimony about the nature of Victor's abuse. Still, there was nail-biting uncertainty as they waited for the court's decision, and for news of Victor's response to the petition that had been formally served to him in Auburn. Would he contest it? Would he come to Virginia City himself to fight the action? The answer came on a blustery March day when their attorney arrived at their apartment with official papers in hand. "It's done," he announced as Clara and Hank stood breathless with anticipation. "The divorce is granted." Caldwell didn't contest, smart of him, really, since fighting it would have made the details public record. Clara stared at the document the lawyer placed in her hands, hardly daring to believe the words printed there. Clara Caldwell, plaintiff, was hereby restored to the status of an unmarried woman. "I'm free," she whispered, looking up at Hank with tears in her eyes. "Truly free." Hank's smile was radiant as he turned to the attorney. "How soon can we be married?" "Right away, if you like," the man replied with a chuckle. "I know a judge who could perform the ceremony tomorrow." Clara and Hank exchanged a long look, years of hopes and dreams concentrated in a single glance. "Tomorrow it is," Hank decided, pulling Clara into an embrace that lifted her off her feet. They were married in the judge's chambers the following afternoon, a simple, quiet ceremony with Patrick and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore a new dress of deep blue silk, and Hank a clean suit borrowed from his cousin. The words they exchanged were traditional, but the emotion behind them was profound, born of everything they'd endured to reach this moment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared. And just like that, Clara Caldwell became Clara Xavier, the transformation as swift and miraculous as dawn breaking after the darkest night. They celebrated with dinner at Virginia City's finest restaurant, splurging on champagne and beefsteak, laughing and talking late into the evening. When they finally returned to their apartment, now truly theirs together, Hank swept Clara into his arms to carry her over the threshold, as was tradition. "Mrs. Xavier," he said, setting her down gently in their sitting room. "How does it feel?" "Right," Clara replied simply. "As if I've finally found where I belong." That night, they truly became husband and wife in every sense, their love for each other expressed in tender touches and whispered words, the culmination of a journey that had begun on a dusty road at dawn months earlier. Spring came to the mountains, and with it, plans for their return to California. The Double X Ranch awaited them, Martha and Illy having kept it running smoothly in Hank's absence. Though there was some risk in returning to a place within Victor's sphere of influence, they refused to let fear dictate their future. "The ranch is our home," Hank said firmly. "I won't let Caldwell or anyone else drive us from it." They left Virginia City in April, traveling by stage and then train to Sacramento, where they stayed briefly with Hank's sister before making the final journey to Grass Valley. The countryside was in full bloom, wildflowers carpeting the meadows and new leaves adorning the trees. To Clara, it felt like the world itself was celebrating their return. Martha welcomed them home with open arms and a feast fit for royalty. The farmhouse had been cleaned from top to bottom. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and a special surprise waited in what had once been Clara's guest room, now transformed into a proper bedroom for the master and mistress of the house. "It's good to have you both home where you belong," Martha declared as they sat down to dinner. "This place hasn't been the same without you." Life settled into a new rhythm, days filled with the work of running the ranch. Evenings spent together on the porch watching the sunset. Nights of peaceful sleep in each other's arms. Clara took over management of the household accounts, discovering a head for business that complemented Hank's practical knowledge of ranching. Together, they made improvements to the property, expanding operations and increasing profits. There were challenges, of course. Some in the community whispered about Clara's past, and occasionally they encountered people from Auburn who recognized her. But with each passing month, those incidents grew rarer, the whispers faded, and their place in the community strengthened. Of Victor, they heard little. He had apparently accepted the divorce with cold pragmatism, turning his attention to business ventures that took him frequently to San Francisco. On the rare occasions when rumors of his activities reached them, Clara felt a momentary chill, but no longer the paralyzing fear that had once controlled her life. "He has no power over us," Hank reminded her during one such moment. "Not anymore." As their first anniversary approached, Clara had news to share, news that filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation. She chose a quiet evening to tell Hank, after they'd finished dinner and were sitting together on the porch swing, watching the first stars appear in the twilight sky. "I have something to tell you," she began, her hand finding his. "Something wonderful, I hope." Hank turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it?" Clara took a deep breath, then placed his hand gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, "in the winter." Hank's expression transformed from surprise to pure joy. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Our baby," Clara nodded, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased," Hank laughed, gathering her into his arms. "Clara, you've made me the happiest man alive again." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "I love you more than I have words to express." "And I love you," Clara replied, leaning into his embrace, "for finding me on that road, for believing in me, for fighting for me, for everything." As night settled over the Double X Ranch, they remained on the porch, talking softly of the future, a future bright with promise, rich with love, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together. Their son was born the following January, a healthy, strong-lunged boy they named James, after Hank's father. He was joined 2 years later by a daughter, Hope, whose arrival coincided with the expansion of the ranch to include neighboring property that Hank had long coveted. The years passed in a tapestry of ordinary joys and sorrows. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Clara and Hank's love deepened with each shared experience. They never forgot how their story began with exhaustion, desperation, and a simple question on a dusty road at dawn, but they came to understand that beginning as the first step in a journey that had led them exactly where they were meant to be. On their 10th anniversary, Clara presented Hank with a special gift, the journal he'd given her in Virginia City, now filled with their story, written in her clear, elegant hand. "Read the last page," she urged as he turned the leather-bound volume reverently in his hands. Hank opened to the final entry, dated that very day, and read aloud. 10 years ago today, I married the man who saved my life, not just by finding me on that road outside Grass Valley, but by showing me that love isn't about possession or control. It's about freedom and choice and building something together, day by day. Our story isn't perfect or easy, but it's ours, and I wouldn't change a single word of it." He looked up, eyes bright with emotion. "Neither would I," he said softly, pulling her into his arms. "Not a single word." And there on the porch of the home they'd built together, with their children playing in the yard and the future stretching boundless before them, Clara and Hank Xavier sealed their decade of love with a kiss that promised countless more to come, a promise they kept for all the days of their lives.